What is that? I mean, we're looking at 10, 15 plus $1 trillion in tax cuts since 2001, while we increase war spending by $1 trillion. Well, that generates the huge budget deficits. Oh, but China and Japan and everybody else keep recycling their dollars because of our trade deficit. We purposely agree to run a trade deficit. This is part of the gimmick. This is part of how the U.S. economic empire is run. These twin deficits, trade and budget deficits, are integral to the whole functioning of the economy, which means you have to have the dollar as the dominant world currency. If the dollar ever falls from its perch as the world currency, which eventually will happen, that's the beginning of the end, you see, because then the whole twin deficits arrangement collapses. And if it collapses, the U.S. has to cut its war spending, has to raise taxes on its rich and its corporations. Or if it doesn't do that, it has to take it out of the hide of the rest of the populace with massive, massive tax cuts. I mean, the spending cuts that are almost unimaginable. You either raise taxes or cut war spending or cut massive social spending. It means the end of Social Security and Medicare, for example, if that should happen. You see, all this sits on this pedestal of the twin deficits that the U.S. has worked out with its client capitalist elites in the rest of the world. They like the arrangement because they get the jobs, you see. They get the U.S. production, moves offshore. It's called free trade, folks. Moves offshore, starts producing offshore, and is imported back into the U.S. And the dollars flow from the U.S. to these other countries and economies, which then recycle it by buying U.S. bonds. That's how the U.S. economic empire functions. And at the apex of all this is the currency that enables it all. 87% of all global trade in goods and services is made with dollars. With dollars. The euro, the pound, the yen, and now the Chinese yuan, trying to get into that mix, is just 13% of all of it. The dollar is the key. And that's why the dollar is kept low and why we have free trade by policies in the U.S. That's why we have free trade. You see, free trade is another cornerstone to this whole economic arrangement. The twin deficits are key. Recycling the dollars back. That's why the U.S. Meets in Beijing every year, Treasury Secretary and their counterparts, to keep this facade going. All right, so that's the fundamental elements. The fundamental elements involved in the U.S. economic empire, right? Trade deficit, budget deficit, recycle the dollars. The U.S. dollar currency is dominant and enables the whole thing to hold together. That's why the recycling of all this from China is not going to stop. That's why it was all nonsense, this announcement this past week. The Chinese are going to continue recycling. And so will the Japanese. By the way, the Japanese have over $1 trillion as well in U.S. bond securities and so forth, right? We've run a trade deficit with them for a long time. And, we don't discriminate. We run the trade deficit with everybody in the world. And they all have an agreement, the all local capitalist elites who are getting a big taste of this whole thing. They get to keep some. That's the new colonialism, the new imperialism. We don't go there and occupy these countries and whack the elite on the head, right? And militarily, at least not initially, militarily tell them what to do and set up a colonial administration like the British did in the 19th century. No, no, no. The U.S. economic empire is far more sophisticated and clever. It's run by these international institutions and U.S. banks that control the money flows and the deals made with the local indigenous capitalist elites. Right? They share in the whole thing, and it's much more secure. The empire is much more secure when you buy off the local elites and give them a piece of the action. A good example is the Saudi family, right? In the 1970s, they took over the Arab American oil company and they nationalized it in other parts of the world too. And we allowed them to do it, as long as they agreed to recycle the money, which was great for buying U.S. jets and military arms and so forth. And that's why the U.S. wants to keep these places fighting amongst themselves, because they keep buying U.S. arms, you see, and recycling the money back to buy F-16s and F-22s and 35s and so forth. Yeah, that's part of the whole arrangement as well. So the twin deficits is key. The dollar is key. And that's why the Chinese are not going to stop selling bonds back to the U.S. or buying bonds from the U.S. and recycling the dollars that build up as a result of the trade deficit that the U.S. wants. You see, and the trade deficit really benefits U.S. corporations. Yeah, because look, a lot of these imports and trade deficit is U.S. company-made goods that are offshore. You see, if you encourage since Reagan the offshoring of U.S. corporations and they move offshore, right? They want to move their these goods that are now produced offshore more cheaply back to the U.S. So two things got to happen if you're doing that, and one is they got to be able to move the goods they produce offshore back to the U.S. without tariffs, i.e., that's what free trade is all about. Free trade is also about creating conditions for U.S. corporations to invest offshore. It's about foreign direct investment, money capital flows, as much as it is goods and services flowing back. Free trade, right? They don't talk about that. They talk about free trade as goods, but it's really money flows, you see, from the U.S. offshore as much as goods flowing back to the U.S. Well, if the goods flow back to the U.S., let's eliminate the tariffs, which would be a cost, which would reduce the profits of U.S. multinational corporations that have located offshore and sending their goods back to the U.S. Yeah. Okay, so free trade is part of this picture. Dollar dominance is part of this picture. The twin deficits are a big part of this picture. And U.S. bonds and treasury bonds and so forth are integral to keeping the whole thing flowing.